his firing, like Strzok's, was politically motivated. And here we go. In the meantime, Monday's big sell-off could be all washed away by tomorrow, so a lot of bulls are hoping and praying and finger crossing. That is because we made up a good deal of the ground today that was lost. And remember the big comeback we had yesterday. We were down 600 points or so, and we recouped most of those losses. All of this with a new report that the government's collecting a lot of money from tariffs over the past 12 months, try about $63 billion. American entities are paying that, of course. Distributors who deal in China trying to buttress you from having to pay that. Regardless, for the administration, that might offer some flexibility in this going forward. That's what they say. What do our panelists say? Market watchers Danielle Shay. We've got Tim Anderson and George C. Danielle, to you on whether this buffets the blow enough, because technically American entities pay that, whether they pass that along to consumers. They try to absorb as much as they can. Debates about whether they really will be able to do that come September 1 when a lot of consumer items come up for these 10% tariffs. But what do you think?
Well, it's correct when the president says that he's collecting billions of dollars, and that's absolutely true. But this money is going to the Treasury Department. It's not going to the companies that are losing their margins. And so what's happening is that these companies are having to either A, shrink their margins, and that's going to impact their corporate profits and their earnings, or they have to pass the cost along to consumers. And at the end of the day, public companies like this, they have to pass the cost along. So that's what's going to end up happening.
All right, that would slow things down a little bit here. And then for those companies, George, exposed to China, that could be a big hit. So far, so good, or maybe I should say so fair. But where do you see it happening?
I think that if anybody thinks that the federal government is the answer to every problem, this is wonderful news. And for those of us who are conservatives in the private sector, think the private sector is the strength of America, it's bad news. It's a friction cost on the economy, and it doesn't do anything unless the federal government cuts its spending, which it hasn't done since the second term of George W. Bush. So I don't think it's any good, and I wish it wasn't around, but we've got to go to war with China, and the president's waging that.
You know, Tim Anderson, a lot of this money they take and give to farmers to help cushion the blow that they're feeling from China stopping buying their goods and all the rest. What do you think of that? Because eventually others affected are going to probably demand the same thing, right?
Well, I think you stated it perfectly. I think you have to look at these tariffs as almost going into a rainy day fund where it will be given out as aid to those people that are being most seriously affected by the trade dispute with China. And clearly, the independent farmers are probably at the top of that list. Now, if you want to talk about the economy overall, we're a $20 trillion economy. If you're talking $100 billion in tariffs, that's 1/200th of the entire economy. It might affect GDP by 1/10, maybe 0.2%. I just think that the consumer is strong enough and earnings are growing fast enough and the jobs market is vibrant enough to withstand that.
And then there's the Fed in this, right, Danielle, that if it keeps cutting rates, that could cushion the blow a little bit. Do you still see that happening?
Yes, that's correct, and that could help, and it's going to have to be what the Fed is going to have to do to try to take away some of this impact from tariffs. But at the same time, these are two different things. Yes, the Fed can cut rates, and that can help stimulate the economy, cause consumers to borrow more, but that's not going to help them if they're going to Costco and they have to pay much higher prices for things that they buy every single week. So it's just a little bit different.
You know, George, there are a number of people are now saying it's possible this is never resolved in the near future. In fact, I think Goldman Sachs, S&P, some of these other firms have said it won't be solved before the presidential election. Then what?
Then we just march further onwards. I think that people are looking at this myopically. You've got to look at it holistically. China is a tremendous competitor of ours now, and we compete against them in all sorts of fronts: trade, national defense, global influence, especially in Asia. And this is part of a big picture. And it's going to be going on for the next several decades. It's just one part of the story. And it's not going to end anytime soon. It's going to go through at least 2020 election and perhaps beyond that.
If it does, Tim, then what? What do you tell clients?
I just think that the market will have a very positive response long term toward the idea that we are trying to change egregious behavior from China that's probably been going on for 20 years. They've never really lived by the World Trade Organization rules, and there are other behaviors that most other countries that we trade with adhere to that they just ignore.
All right. And on we wait and wait, right? Guys, thank you all very, very much. Again, the Dow up about 371 points. So these concerns dissipating today because both sides do plan to talk next month. We'll see. Meanwhile, an outpouring of bipartisan support for new gun